you so much. Hello, everyone. This is Alper Memis. I'm one of the co-founders of the Picus Security and the CEO. So first of all, it's a very, pleasant to be here to make this presentation. And I'm also looking forward to follow-up discussions about the threat exposure management. So why threat exposure management is important? Because in cybersecurity, we have been doing a lot of investments, and still the question of how exposed we are is not a question that we can have a definite answer. And I think what really makes our job very difficult as industry is, after all these investments, all these efforts that we give to the services, so we still have a siloed approach to exposure management. But we'll talk about it further. So why we are doing all these exposure management activities? Of course, cyber security is a business function, and with any business function, we would like to understand what's our risk level, right? So in cyber security, although we try to understand our risk level, there is not a simple and easy answer to that. And as we don't have an easy and simple answer to that, it really becomes a problem for us. Okay, what are the things that we need to focus in order to reduce cyber risk? So if you look at cyber risk today, according to World Economic Forum, cyber insecurity is actually the fourth largest important risk that organizations are facing. So I think really nothing that you guys already don't know. But let's look at a figure that's very important. So we as organizations have been investing into cybersecurity for quite a long time, and I keep repeating myself. So if you look at any cybersecurity vendor, including us, we will tell you how the cybersecurity growth rates are higher than the IT security, all the services that we come. But after all this effort, that's how we came. So if you look at IBM's data breach survey, we will unfortunately see that 82% of the organizations have a risk of facing a data breach in the next 12 months. It's very cliche, but it really tells us that, okay, it's a matter of when, not if. So, but what is the thing that we are missing? Yes, everyone has their own ideas, and but what's the thing that we are missing? What are the certain actions that we need to do, flip the odds? And how can we really understand and reduce cyber risks? So I will spend the rest of the presentation around it. So understanding risk is difficult, cyber risk is more difficult. But to us, the most important reason why understanding cyber risk is difficult is because all these exposure management activities that we are having, we have disconnected silos. So we have been doing vulnerability management, attack surface management, automated pen testing, red teaming. They all provide insights if you look in an isolated manner. But what is the challenge? The challenge is how these insights relate to each other. That is really the difficulty comes in. The second challenge with all this traditional vulnerability management approach that we have, unfortunately, vulnerability lists lack context and prioritization. And context is customer context. So what is the business context? What is the certain threat groups that can target this organization? What are the critical, users assess? We don't have this information as well. And, the third pillar is the point that everyone knows. Our business is expanding rapidly, but so is our attack surface as well. But the challenge is, as our attack surface is expanding rapidly, all the security controls, policies, and configurations, they really become less effective over time. Okay, so let's focus on the first pillar. We believe that this is the most important reason why we don't understand our risk, and no matter what we do, we cannot reduce it at a level that we feel comfortable. Because what we believe is exposure assessment and exposure validation are, like whatever we do to understand our exposure and to validate our exposure, they are undeniably providing a lot of value. But the challenge is these are all siloed exposure information, and they are disconnected. So what do we mean by disconnect? Let's talk a little bit more on that too, right? So exposure assessment. We are all doing vulnerability management, as I said. You know, class sector to posture management. We are doing CTI. This provides us broad set of data and all kinds of vulnerabilities that we are looking for. Usually simple and really inexpensive way to collect the data. But whatever we are getting from exposure assessment activities, and they are definitely needed, we do not have anything about the exploitability of these vulnerabilities. We have the list. We are looking at external attack surface management technologies. We know some of the gaps, but we don't know whether they are exploitable or not. We don't have an evidence-based understanding. If you look at exposure validation, okay, I have exposures, I have the assessment, I have the vulnerability list, but on the other side of the things, I have the compensating controls. I'm doing validation to understand whether the risk is real or not, right? I have breach and attack simulation, automated pen testing, manual pen testing, automated red teaming. The great thing about the exposure validation approach are they are evidence-based. They really tell you whether these vulnerabilities are exploitable or not. They can really tell you about the security gaps, misconfigurations. But the problem with this approach, they don't lack the full context of the attack surface. Let's take into account an attack simulation technology. It's great. It's going to tell you whether your technologies are working or not. But is it really tied to your real vulnerabilities and assets? So we have the vulnerabilities. We have the asset information. We have the patching list. We have the compensating controls that we have been investing for a while. We have the automated pen testing findings. But none of them are speaking to each other. So we are looking at 6 different screens to understand our risk. Even we have the manpower and budget to look at the 6 different screens. So maybe a risk that we see from one screen is not the risk that we need to focus anyway. Just to give you an example, think about 2 identical organizations, Organization A and Organization B. And Organization A and Organization B, let's assume that they have the same assets and the same vulnerabilities, very possible. Organization A's security management decided to invest into security controls. I'm not going to name, but the best EDR, best SIEM, whatever, so best firewall. And let's assume that Organization B's leadership decided not to invest into any compensating control. Same assets, same vulnerabilities, one designed with the best of the best security controls, one with nothing. If you run the best of the best vulnerability prioritization technologies, and they are great by the way, you will get the same risk score. But one has the compensating controls. Maybe a threat actor who can exploit a vulnerability which is unpatched in my asset could be prevented and detected by my technology anyway. So this is how far we come, unfortunately, not understanding our cyber risks. So, of course, there is not a silver bullet in cybersecurity, but definitely what we need is to reduce the disconnect between our exposure and assessment and exposure validation methodologies. So what's the thing that we can think about? All my presentation is very conceptual without referring to any product or any technology because it really requires not only technology but a mindset change, right? Because we definitely need a paradigm shift in order to understand our cyber risk. We need to have a more integrated end-to-end type of approach. And everything starts with discovering, right? So if we don't know what we don't know, if we don't know what we have, how we are going to fix it. So definitely we have different exposures coming from the different activities as we talk about exposure assessment, exposure validation. The first way to start is the discovery. Okay, I have these activities. How can I correlate all these exposures and really bring it to a more meaningful place? Even if we do that, there will be 20,000, 30,000 exposures. And we all know that, without a prioritization, we will try to fix all, which is, going to be a suicide because we will in the end end up with maybe fixing some of the exposures that are not really that important, right? So to understand, the prioritization, and I will spend, 1 more minute in the next slide on that, we definitely need to understand the business context. So if we know the threat actors that are targeting us, if we know our assets, vulnerabilities, and how it tied to, the different threat groups, then we can start really talking about the prioritization as we can really consider the business context. Validation is something, definitely needed. I think any exposure assessment activity without understanding validation will be less powerful, because validation will really tell us whether something is exploitable or not. Again, from an inside view, we can look at the exposures and say we are too risky. Again, maybe these exposures are not exploitable after all. And everything really comes with the fixing the problems. So when we have the validated and prioritized list, can we fix them by using more automated type of approach? Because one of the problems within the industry, and then we as a vendor probably being part of it, is we talk about always the problems, right? Okay, you have this problem, and then when it really comes to how to fix it, that's the real value comes in, because as we are only just part of the problem, then the value is less, right? So let's look at the prioritization. So what do we mean by the context, and why do we really require context? So prioritization to us, we need to take the identify critical users, critical identities, assess servers and data. Because most of the time with the exposure management, if we know what are the, the critical users assess that we need to, the focus first, I think that tagging really helps to focus on the things that matters the most. And again, correlation across vulnerabilities and data silos will help us, because otherwise we are going to see all the threats in the same way, but all the threats are not created in the same way given the customer context. And validation really, again, ensure us we are, focusing on the right things. So what do we mean by the validation? I think there are different ways to do validation. You can do manual pen testing, you can do automated red teaming, you can do breach and attack simulation. But I think the most important pillar is, I think what really, compliance is an integral part of the security, but if you look at the compliance, it's in a way either white or black, right? Either you are compliant or not compliant. But in security, the frequency of the exposure validation activities really matter a lot, because, most frequent activities will enable you to see your changing environment, and we know how fast it's changing, right? So if we continue to validate our risk and uncover specific attack points and choke points, what do we mean by the choke points? If you look at any map that can tell you how the attack paths can move, there are usually certain choke points, and if you fix the choke points, you can fix most of the risks that you are facing. So let me wrap up like what we talk about. I think the main challenge is, yes, we are investing a lot of money into cybersecurity technologies, including ourselves. Cybersecurity technologies are really good, really providing value, but the biggest challenge really comes from all these siloed activities. They are not talking to each other. We cannot correlate the insight to each other, which means we are only looking on one part of the puzzle, which is very meaningful, but we don't understand how they really relate to each other. The only way to really, start thinking about the real risk, and as I said, 82% is a ratio, maybe, little bit exaggerated, but we still run a significant data breach after making all these investments. $250 billion goes into only cybersecurity technologies globally, and there are more investment is going to cybersecurity services. It has to be, but how can we really, make it more meaningful? So bringing asset, vulnerability, CTI, and compensating controls together is the key. After we do that, again, we need to do a prioritization, because we can't really fix everything. So we need to focus on the things that matters the most. And usually when we start with 20,000 exposures, it can really, streamline or reduce to 150 exposures that can really, make up the 90% of the risk. And then validating these exposures to pinpoint your focus related to prioritization is very critical. Because I think without validation, we cannot really understand, it's a theoretical exposure, or is it something exploitable? And from an operator view, what's important is, again, how can we quickly mitigate this by using vendor-specific mitigations, OS hardening, cyber risk dashboarding, then this is the more, where the automation comes into play. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.